Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sound TV podcast. I'm your host, Jason Wise. On today's episode, we have a very special audio documentary. We've been working for a while to tell the story of how apples, and cider in particular, helped drive the founding of this country and continue to help drive the identity of being American. On today's episode, I am joined by esteemed author Ben Watson, the author of Cider, Hard, and Sweet, History, Traditions, and Making Your Own, to tell the story of how the simple apple and the drink created from it, alcoholic cider, helped create the identity of America and in some ways helped split us apart and bring us back together again. Before we get to the episode, I want to remind everybody the holidays are coming. And if you are looking for the perfect gift, look no further. Our blind tasting card game, Blinders, is one of the most fun things you can do with a group of people and a bottle of wine. Go to blindersgame.com to get your packs right now for 50% off through the holidays. But order quick. These are going to run out. blindersgame.com. Without further ado, our audio documentary about cider and the American dream. Ben, it's an honor to have you on the Sound TV podcast. I truly appreciate your time. You have a pretty illustrious career, and I'd like for you to quickly introduce yourself. What is it that you do, and why are you so qualified to talk about apples and cider?
I think probably the thing that makes me most qualified is the fact that I've just been interested in them for so long and have been a lifelong passion of mine to seek out different varieties of apples. And then about 25 or more years ago, I got into, really about 30 years ago, I got into researching cider in a more systematic way and wrote the book Cider, Hard, and Sweet 25 years ago. And since then, it's been a growing movement, sort of a renaissance of cider that I've been privy to and have been learning a lot more and continue to learn a lot about both apple varieties and cider. But my work's also been in biodiversity. I worked for about 10 years with Slow Food, the international organization, and I focused on apples because that was what I was familiar with. But really, I've worked with all sorts of, uncommon but worthy plants and animals around the world to try to preserve our common heritage and culture and biodiversity.
Well, one of the things that I think is so incredibly interesting about apples, especially when talking about the United States, is just every single time I think of how important they are to the history of this country, I find out more. And I realize I haven't even touched the surface. The way this country formed and expanded and how important apples were in every single little step of that. I'm going to do something that hopefully somebody of your stature will get annoyed with on this podcast, is I'm going to ask you some pretty big questions and force you to kind of distill them, no pun intended, into something that is understandable. And I want to start with just the apple, the fruit itself, the piece of biological matter that is that. Where in the world is the apple from? And then I want to get to how the hell it ended up on the shores of the United States, or what was then a colony.
There are all kinds of apple species, but the apple that we consider the apple now, the ones we buy in the market, called usually these days Malus domestica, so the domesticated apple, that arose from many species of apples that combine their genes, because apples will cross-pollinate with each other and create new genetic packages, if you will, whether they're varieties or whether they're different species contributing genes to the apple. And so the answer to your question is, years ago, the famous Russian scientist Nikolai Vavilov led an expedition. He was trying to discover where the center of diversity, he called it, for different crops was in the world. And he determined that the apple had originated in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Western China, the Tian Shan Mountains. And it's in those areas that, without many people around at all, apples naturally cross-pollinated, developed over many, many hundreds and thousands of years. Some people think that the domesticated apple is the result of only 5 trees that were originally this variety that started bearing fruit in Central Asia. There's a sort of an ancestor species that's the main ancestor species there that contributed to the apple. But there are also other wild apples that contributed to it as well. And the interesting thing is that really human beings had very little to do with it. And many people have theorized that the apple was really developed by bears because bears obviously ate the fruit and did what bears do in the woods. And that helped develop some of these and carry on the genetics of some of these cross-pollinated apples. And they would obviously eat the ones that were the tastiest fruits. And in terms of the spread of the apple, you could probably thank horses for that more than anything else, because the trade routes, the Great Silk Road coming from China to Persia, would go through this area of Central Asia. Traders, migrants, whomever, would take the apples to feed their horses along the way. And so conveniently along this trade route, you'd have these little packages of horse dung with apple seeds inside of them. So the apple spread fairly quickly in the great scheme of things.
What is it about the apple itself, the way it's constructed, that made it such a good thing to pass on and on? Whether, I guess, first with animals and then with people. Why not, the banana? Why not a citrus? Why was the apple so well suited for this kind of travel?
It's widely adapted to temperate regions of the world. I mean, you can grow it. Subtropical, it's not that great because it needs some winter. Usually, most apples need winter chilling period to set flowers and fruit in the spring. But as long as you supply that, the apple is usually really successful in a very large part of the north temperate region and also in other regions that have cool enough winters to do that. So I would say that's one reason. I mean, it's not grown in, you're not going to find it in Burma or Indonesia or something like that, but that's why you have other fruits. They have tropical fruits that we can't grow.
So it finds its way spreading sort of across from Central Asia into Europe. And obviously, this is where our story kind of picks up. I'm sure there's a tremendous other story on the other side of the globe. When we're thinking about Europeans traveling to what would then be called the New World, how did it become part and parcel of getting on these ships? And I'm also curious, at what point did it become, here's a fruit to eat, to here's something we want to drink? I'm curious if if those go step in step with each other.
Well, yeah, there's a long cider tradition in certain parts of Europe. The Romans certainly knew about apples, but there wasn't the kind of diversity of varieties, and they weren't really caring so much about the actual varieties as we do today, where there are tens of thousands of named varieties of apples. And they didn't really distinguish very much between apples and pears, and they did make a drink called pomorum, which could be apple, could be pear, could be a combination of apple and pear. They weren't really apparently very nice about doing that. But after Roman times and classical times, the apple really became fixed in Western Europe, England and northern France, mostly by the Normans. Although having said that, probably almost 2,000 years ago, they were making cider. Probably the oldest cider making tradition in the world is northern Spain and the Basque country. And they were probably making cider even in Roman times. We don't have a really good historical record. We can go back to, I don't know, around 800 AD or something like that. But it became established in certain places where a grain wasn't necessarily grown as much for ale, or it was more expensive to do things. In terms of England, there wasn't a lot of wood. Wood was a limiting factor because they were cutting down a lot of it to make into ship masts and houses and various other things. So you need heat to brew anything, or to obviously distill anything too, but even to brew ale, you need to have a heat source. Whereas apples, they ferment like wine. So they're made like wine. There's no heat involved. So it was very attractive from that standpoint. And also there were certain regions where the apple grew very well, like Normandy in France and Brittany and in Western England. a lot of parts of southern England, but especially in western England and the West counties. The soils are very good. They're very deep. They're very rich. And those were places that cider caught on as a local beverage and to an extent something that could be traded, but really it was more delicate than other kinds of stronger spirits. So it didn't tend to get exported great distances in the early days.
We're speaking about something that would have been traditionally all alcoholic, right? I mean, this would have all been fermented. There's not like my kids drinking apple juice, and we'll get to kind of where that came from. But this is all alcohol, and how much, like how alcoholic would it have been? Are there records of the making of this?
It would have been probably, I don't think they weren't measuring percentage alcohol back then, but it would have probably been somewhere close to what the baseline is today, which is maybe 6 or 7% alcohol. I mean, a lot of that depends on the climate. And, obviously, if you have a really warm summer and you get more sugar in the apples, if you ferment it to dryness, you're going to get a little bit higher alcohol because the sugars ferment into alcohol. But the interesting thing is it was widely consumed then, including by, just as it was in America, by children and laborers. And they drank something that was a much weaker alcohol because once you press ground apples on your press and you put the first batch of cider into barrels to ferment, they then would refresh by putting a little water on top of the pumice, and they'd press it again because there'd still be plenty of matter left in the apple pumice, and they'd make something called ciderkin or water cider, which was probably about half the strength or less of the first cider that you'd make. So maybe 2 or 3% alcohol.
Okay, this is great. So so everybody's drinking this, and obviously, I'm assuming it's a preservative. It makes the water a little safer to drink in a time when water was not exactly the most safe thing.
Yeah.
How much did they drink? And I know that there's a very different outlook on alcohol today than there was then, but were they drinking a gallon of this a day? Were they just having it sort of every once in a while? How much were they consuming?
I think in the areas where it was grown and it was plentiful, they were drinking quite a bit. I think it was maybe the 1880s in England. It was legal to pay agricultural laborers in cider as part of their pay, and they would get 2 quarts a day or something like that of cider. That was the stipulated thing that you'd pay all of your farm workers, and it was done in this country as well. And actually, when it came to America, many people were being paid because there was so little local currency that was being minted. It was mainly a barter economy to a great extent. And most people were farmers too. And so it was easy to trade commodity for commodity. But the few people who weren't farmers, like the local clergymen or school teachers or something like that, they would often get paid a specified amount in cider as part of their pay for
It's
the year.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Incredible. I wish some of my pay was in cider nowadays,
Yeah, yeah,
unfortunately.
it really was cool. It was a cider economy in the U.S. back then.
Just how early did apples hit the shores of North America? Is this on the first, second, third? I'm assuming this is all pretty much the English coming over here, right? I would assume that the Spanish and Portuguese ships were not carrying apples, or am I wrong in that?
I think you're probably wrong in it, although the places where apples thrive tended to be places that the Northern Europeans were settling, and it wasn't just the English. In fact, the first actual tree, I mean, most of what was being imported was seed originally,
Mhm.
because you figure you have these long ocean voyages. You're not going to in the initial period of time, you're not going to be importing trees. They wouldn't survive the transit. So most of what was done in the 17th century was importing seeds or cuttings that would be grafted onto native. We haven't talked about the native species of apples in the U.S., but they were used as rootstocks sometimes and grafted with actual European cider apples when they wanted the particular variety to be carried on. And that was being done in Virginia. But even before then, The first apple tree, as such, that was already grafted, was imported by Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor of, New Amsterdam,
Right.
which is now New York. That his farm was in it was called the Bowery, and so that became the name of the neighborhood. And he planted that tree. It was a Bon Chrétien apple tree, and it stood in the Bowery until it was just after the Civil War. That tree survived.
Wow.
So it lived for 200 years and finally got knocked over by a cart
Oh my God.
after the Civil War.
That's just absolutely incredible. But isn't there some challenges with, I mean, I want to talk about sort of the biology and adaptability of apples. I mean, obviously, maybe you can start with the fact that there were apples here. And I don't think a lot of people think of a native plant was actually here. So tell me about that, but then also talk to me about kind of why these apples were so adaptable. And then the seed variation must have been a bit of a mess. I mean, that's you're kind of playing craps with what you're going to get, right? So let's start with what was here when they got here.
Well, what was here when they got here, there are probably, depending on who you ask, 4 or 5 different species of Malus, the genus that apples belong to, that are native to North America. Some of them are Western varieties. There's one that's more a Midwestern variety. And there are several ones that are common mostly in the South, like the Malus carinaria, Malus angustifolia. They're all very small, fruited apples. They're true crab apples. When we talk about crab apples these days, most people call something a crab apple if it's just small. That isn't the definition of a crab apple. A crab apple is something that is not a Malus domestica apple, at least in my book. That's the definition. So there are wild species all over the world, but there are mainly 4, but possibly 5 apple varieties in North America that could cross-pollinate with the domestic apples, but often were used in the very early days as rootstocks for the apple varieties that were coming over as cuttings or scionwood from Europe to grow orchards. But they're not very suitable for and there's no real indication, even though there's no written record of Native Americans in the early days doing anything with them anyway. They may have used them for some purposes, but food was not one of them.
Yeah.
They're not really palatable, and there's no real indication. The Native Americans did grow domestic apples when they started to be planted over here and had orchards themselves in New York State and many other places. But as far as crab apples go, they weren't actively trying to grow those or collect them or use them. And there's no
Yeah.
real indication that they made cider out of them either.
Can you explain to people what happens when you plant an apple seed and how, for good or for bad, the results may not be desirable?
Well, an apple seed is a function of the parent variety and whatever has pollinated that particular pistil in the flower. And you think about it, you open up an apple, and generally there are at least 5 seeds in there, sometimes more than that if it's a different kind of a variety, but usually 5 seeds in an apple. Each one of those seeds, if you plant them out, could and probably will yield a slightly different, genetically different apple tree. Now, in very rare cases, you can plant seeds from a few different varieties that will come what we call relatively true to type from seed. So you'll get something fairly close to resembling what the parent apple that it came from looks like. One variety is called Nickajack. It's a southern variety that's famous for that. Wolf River comes relatively true to type, but it's just a handful. Most of them, you'll get something completely different. And that was a good thing and a bad thing. It's a bad thing if you're trying to carry on an apple that you particularly like. And that's why you have to essentially clone the apples. You're doing it, it's an ancient form of cloning that we still use, vegetative propagation, called grafting. You cut a cutting of new wood, first-year wood, in the winter, and then you graft it onto a rootstock or onto a branch of another tree, and that will develop into the same variety. So in other words, if you say, gee, I really love this Macintosh apple, let me take a cutting of my great Macintosh apple and put it on this other branch of this tree that could be anything, any kind of apple variety. That branch will always be a Macintosh, with few exceptions. Again, nature is not categorical. I mean, sometimes you'll graft something onto a tree, and very occasionally it will turn into something that doesn't resemble either one of the varieties. And that's called a sport, or it's a mutation. It's a kind of mutation. But generally, you'll get the same variety that you graft onto the roots of another tree.
I do love that nature does not want to stay still. It does want to keep changing and wants to kind of fight against our will. It's a very fascinating process of this tug and pull and push. We
well,
try
apples
to
are a
impose.
lot like human beings, aren't they? You know, you think about it. I mean, we're all unique genetic products of our parents. We're not genetically identical to either one of our parents. So why would we expect apples to be? They're very human-like fruit.
I love that. So let's talk about it arrives in America, these domesticated apples, and just how quickly did it become, I guess, this is not a term, but America's fruit, which then became America's drink. And how important is it for us finding an identity? I'm just curious as far as the founding of this country. I know that this is a big topic.
Well, in the early colonial times and early America, 9 out of 10 people were farmers, homestead farmers to a great extent, unless they were, they had an estate. But even then, they were growing things for self-reliance and self-sufficiency. So if you think about it, apples were the most useful kind of thing that you could grow on your farm. They provided, fresh eating. You could preserve them, make various products out of them. And as you say, I mean, back in the pre-refrigeration days, the only way to keep cider fresh or not to have it, turn into, I was going to say turn into vinegar, but vinegar was a highly useful product used for everything, for preserving, for cleaning, just like we use it today, for many, many uses. So apples were so integral to the rural economy on farm and as a means of exchange. And apple trees, also standard apple trees, not like semi-dwarf or dwarf trees that we have today, they might produce 25 or 30 bushels of apples. That's a lot of fruit.
Wow.
For one tree. So if you planted different trees that would ripen at different times, you could actually have a prodigious amount of fruit grown on the farm with relatively little effort and be able to provide for a lot of your needs.
Interesting. What I kind of want to also dispel really fast, because I don't think a lot of people truly understand what the difference between cider and apple juice is. We'll take a quick step back here.
You mean fresh cider and apple juice?
Sure.
Like the stuff that you press, and that's actually functionally there's not much difference between the two. And a lot of the confusion came in because of prohibition and the bad name that cider got, because a lot of it was fermented into alcohol. And that's when people started to call, the title of my book is Cider Hard and Sweet. Well, hard cider is what we call in America alcoholic cider.
Mhm.
But in England, if you tell somebody, oh, the cider is hard, that's not a compliment. It means that it's kind of old and stale tasting. In the rest of the world, it's sort of like the metric system. Think about it like that. In North America, it's completely different than the rest of the world. We refer to fresh pressed juice that is not processed or clarified as cider. So it's cloudy, it's brownish red, what you'd expect to have as fresh cider. Everywhere else in the world, it's called juice. It's also called must when it's fresh. The rest of the world, when they say cider, they mean hard cider, what we would call hard cider, which leads to some complications sometimes. I remember a story several years ago about a couple who were vacationing over in France, and it was a very warm day, and they had their baby along with them. They said, "Oh, we need to get something for the baby to drink because it's very hot outside." And so they asked for some cider, some cider. The people found out that they had given their young child some cider, and they were scandalized because it was 1 or 2% alcohol. It was not very strong, but even the French were shocked that they would give cider to their youngster because they didn't know. They figured when they see something that said cidre doux, sweet cider, they figured, "Oh, okay, well, that's fine. We can give the baby that."
So I want to talk about how cider kind of became a symbol for independence here. I think it's a really interesting thing, and maybe something people don't realize now, how important cider was to not just as a symbol, but as an actual action to, I guess, distancing ourselves from, at that time, English rule. Why did cider become such a symbol of American independence?
I'd say that maybe that's a little bit overstated. I think mainly it was because it was seen as such a homestead beverage and a rural staple, no matter where you were in the country, because, as we said, apples grow well anywhere in the temperate areas. So unless you were down in Florida or southern Georgia or something, you're going to be able to grow pretty good apples. So for farmers, it was necessary, and it was a means of wealth and independence because it was a commodity that was fairly easy to grow and didn't require you. You could be off growing your other crops most of the time. By the time you needed to deal with a big apple harvest in the fall, you were starting to wind down on a lot of your agricultural year. And people actually had time to, harvest the apples, to process them, to make cider, to do whatever they needed to do, rather than worrying about it in the spring and summer when they were plowing and sowing and harvesting grain.
So it kind of like, it was just sort of we would self-rely. We didn't need to kind of rely on goods coming from England or anything. Is that kind of true, that it gave us a bit of a self-governance through this in a weird way?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days, I mean, I'm sure most of the people, even the people who settled New England, would have been much happier drinking ale exclusively, but it was mostly had to be imported from England because of the fact that the climate was very different back then. It was a cooler climate in New England, and you could not grow barley up here in the 18th century.
Hmm.
It was just too cold. That was the main limiting factor. Further south, you could, and so there was much more brewing going on down there, but in the old New England provinces and New York, that's one reason that apples were seen as something to ferment. And believe me, they looked around for a lot of different things to try to ferment when they got here. Nothing really worked. They tried pumpkins, they tried persimmons, because the American persimmon is native. Nothing really made any sense until they started growing apples widely and they realized we got it now. This is it.
That's great. So when I think about kind of the founding fathers, and we're talking about alcoholic beverages, I know some of these guys were pretty big drinkers. And I often think of Thomas Jefferson, with him trying desperately to plant, Vitis vinifera, French grapes in Virginia, to mostly disastrous results, frankly. But you don't really consider the cider now. And I'm sure it was just everybody did back then. What are some of the founding fathers and influential figures that really championed cider, talked about it, grew it, drank it?
Well, John Adams, the name of your producer, the
That's right.
eponymous John Adams, our second president, was a big champion of cider, and he was said to drink a quart of cider at breakfast every morning, which was not uncommon, but he promoted it as being a health-giving beverage, and a lot of people did. They drank it, and they were fully behind giving a weaker cider to their children even because, we talked a little bit about the quality of water. Part of the quality issue of water back in colonial times was people just didn't like the taste of some of the minerals in the water. So you think about
Hmm.
when you go to an unfamiliar city and you stay over and you say, "Oh, I didn't like the water in that hotel." I mean, it was a little bit like that, except that they had to live there forever. They couldn't really switch out. If they had something that might have been really healthy for them, but they didn't like the taste of it, they weren't going to drink it. But you had pointed out the safety of the water too, because most of the water was surface water. And there were so many animals, not just in the town, but in rural areas too. There was one instance that I found in a historical reference in New Hampshire where used to be a tremendously fertile area for growing corn up in northern New Hampshire. And Rogers Rangers, the old outfit, a lot of those veterans settled up there. Well, they were growing corn and to beat the band, but rather than recycling what we would do now, the composting the animal manure from their cows and putting it on the ground to build back the fertility, they were dumping it in the Israel River up in Lancaster, New Hampshire. They were just dumping fresh manure in the river. So you can imagine why people didn't want to drink water. I mean, milk and cider were the two obvious choices.
Thankfully, that practice has stopped. I know we're probably not completely taking care of our rivers, but at least we're not dumping manure in
And
them.
now
at
we
the
have
current
now we
moment.
have PFAS instead
Yeah,
of manure, I guess.
maybe a little scarier, but all right. So I guess at this point, and I'm kind of weary to do this, but I think we need to bring up our friend Johnny Appleseed. I'd love for you to tell me who he is, why we still talk about him, and kind of also maybe dispel some myths and maybe create some new ones. What are your thoughts on this guy when I ask somebody who's an Apple expert like yourself about Johnny Appleseed?
John Chapman was somebody who grew up in Leominster, Massachusetts. He was somebody who grew up after the Revolution largely, and he became somebody who he had a string of frontier nurseries. And back then, the frontier was Indiana. That's about as far west as people were going at that point. The government was offering land to people to settle, but there were certain stipulations that you had to improve the land. Even if you didn't actually move out there right away and build a house, you had to at least show some indication that you were improving the land. Well, one of the easiest ways to do that was to plant apple trees. So Chapman, he gathered a huge amount of apple seeds and planted them in these frontier nurseries that he would hire local people to sort of take care of for him while he was away. And he would periodically go out there and visit them. And then he would sell 10 or 20 trees to settlers to plant on their properties. So he was really a businessman. As to why he did seeds instead of grafted trees, it was said to be a religious thing because he was part of this Swedenborgian philosophy religion. He thought that it was improper to graft, and other people have felt like this historically, that was against the will of God or whatever to graft an apple tree and carry on a variety from one rootstock to another. Hence, apple seeds. And also, people were using them to make cider. And you had asked before about what's the problem with using seeds. There is no problem. It's just that it's maybe 1 in 10,000 apples will be something that you'll really, really want to eat as what we would recognize as a dessert apple. I mean, there are whole forests of these wild apples in Kazakhstan. They did a collecting expedition. Geneva, New York is where they have the agricultural experiment station that handles apples. And back in the 80s and early 90s, they went over to Kazakhstan and collected fruit. And some of the fruits that they found there were elite fruits, and they took cuttings of those to propagate those. Most they took as seed. The elite ones, if you or I ate one of those apples, you'd say, wow, this is really good. What's this variety name, and can I find it in the store? It was completely wild, and it just happened to be the lucky one of 1,000 or one of 10,000 that was a really edible, nice apple, eating apple. So that's why people use them for cider, because no matter how acidic and tannic an apple is and unpalatable, once you grind them and press them into cider, you can make good cider from those apples. That's the bottom line. Now we're looking around, ironically, for apples that have more tannins in them. I mean, the European ones do, but now we're looking around for traditional American varieties and new varieties. Some people are collecting apples from the wild to make their ciders because they have more bitterness in them that leads to a better structured hard cider.
How much did Johnny Appleseed, in quotes, how responsible was he for planting? I mean, how much volume are we talking about of apple tree orchards? And where's geographically, where are we talking? We're talking from like the Ohio River Valley, that
Yeah,
area?
yeah, and he got seeds from. I mean, one trip that he took to get seeds, he took all the way down to New Orleans and came up the river system that way. But I'd say Ohio, Indiana, to some extent probably Michigan, but not very much further west than what were then the Northwest territories of the U.S. As far as I know, he didn't establish any orchards of his own. He just had seedling nurseries, essentially, and people would buy these trees from him at these local nurseries that were generally along the river system because back in those days there weren't as many roads. The river travel was pretty important.
Well, we're going to come back to a question of whether or not any of these orchards or any of these old apple varietals are still around towards the end of this. We're now moving into a really fascinating time here for the United States. We are a country at this point. We have, with a lot of help from our friends, have beat the British, and we are now a colony. My question is, at this point, is cider sort of the drink of America? Is this what the common person is drinking? If I go into a tavern, or I'm at home, or if I'm in New York City and I have a drink, what am I drinking? Is cider this ubiquitous? It's just everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, cider or whiskey, and there are obviously distilled drinks too. Yeah, I mean, cider was just ubiquitous and it was cheap because everybody made it. Although there were exceptions. I mean, people started to look at quality of cider pretty early on. Some of the Shakers were known as a group that made excellent cider, and their cider sold for a much higher price than just regular farmhouse-made cider. And as I say, vinegar was something that was probably worth about 5 times the amount by volume, but cider itself was very inexpensive and very available.
At what point was the last kind of period when cider sort of symbolized American identity?
Well, the election of 1840 was something that was very significant. That was when William Henry Harrison won. Old Tippecanoe and
And
Tyler
Tyler too.
too.
Yep.
Yeah, and that was the cider barrel. It was used as a symbol, the log cabin and cider campaign of 1840. Depending on what your perspective is, it was not entirely flattering because it was a very nativist statement. This is us, log cabin and cider barrels.
Right.
It was sort
Yeah.
of 1840s MAGA. It was a message, but it was not welcomed by everyone, especially new immigrants.
Very, very, very interesting. So those immigrants wouldn't have been drinking cider. They would have been drinking something like what? The Irish, maybe whiskey, or
Yeah, I mean, 1840 was a little bit early to get into brewing in a huge way, although in the later years, that's one thing that contributed to ciders being subjugated to beer and ale, because the immigrants who came over at that period of time were from Northern Europe, especially Germany, and settling in the Midwest. And also there was a consolidation after the Civil War which continued through World War I, of people moving into more urban areas. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to put a brewery in the middle of nothing,
right.
whereas it made eminently good sense to put a brewery in the middle of a city because you had a greater population base, and so local breweries sprung up at that time. So it was partly from where people came from. When the Italians came, the Italians preferred wine. The Northern Europeans, the Scandinavians, and the Germans preferred beer. The English, I mean, they liked ales too, but again, we had that sort of break of cultural influences that came in. And that, coupled with prohibition, which made everything illegal, was a turning point for cider.
So at this point, cider kind of becomes this sort of old fashioned feeling drink. Am I correct in saying that it kind of became this like, cities are a more in vogue place to live. And so you're in a city, you drink beer. And the people that are out there, the rural people, are drinking cider. Is this sort of right that it's sort of starting to lose its sheen?
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, cider is something that doesn't travel as well as stronger alcohol wines or beers that may be helped out by having some hops and things in them to help preserve them. The network of roads in the early days in colonial times was terrible. So you weren't going to import cider from 2 states away in most cases unless you were bringing it by boat. It was a local drink, partly by necessity and partly because of just the lesser number of people in the rural areas who would keep it alive.
It's funny to see that one of the apple's greatest strengths then becomes its weakness, and that cider doesn't travel very well. I know that I'm about to ask you a question that could be the dissertation of 100 students at, a major university. But can you put me in the mind state of what's happening in this country as the temperance movement is starting to work? Because I mean, obviously, what led up to prohibition is a 47-part episode on, but just in a basis, kind of where are we at and how did that come to affect cider, let alone all alcohol?
In the 19th century, there was a lot of nasty alcohol in this country, and the temperance movement was a social movement because men were getting drop dead drunk, abusing their families and wives and families. And so there was a legitimate reason, to blame that on alcohol. Of course, you could also blame it on the men who were over consuming alcohol. But alcohol and even cider back in the 1880s, there's a famous book by a man named Trowbridge who wrote about cider when they started to try to make cider in the cities. And this is why it didn't translate to the cities in other ways, because they would adulterate it and they would call stuff cider that was fermented out of rotten beets, vinegar,
Oh, wow.
all sorts of additives to it. It was very, very impure. It was totally different from the cider that you would make just pressing your own apples and making it on the farm. It was really an evil drink, and it's not surprising that cider got lumped into, and they would also fortify it with distilled spirits, so it would be much, much stronger. It got lumped in with other kinds of distilled liquor. And so it was quite a difference between the early days and John Adams and the founders saying, this is a healthful beverage. It had come so far into being corrupted that it really sort of deserved being lumped in with the other alcohols and temperance. And what happened is that people who grew a lot of cider orchard or a lot of apple orchards were cut down because the growers were sympathetic to temperance and they didn't want to be associated with something that wasn't any good and demonized for growing apple. So the apple got a bad name too because they associated it with cider making. But that was the time as refrigeration started to come in as well. That's where we got the great separation into sweet and hard cider. And sweet cider was a marketing term by farmers and the industry to say, this is fresh stuff. This isn't what you associate with cider. That's why we call cider something different from the rest of the world.
In my refrigerator, I have apple juice for my kids. It looks more like cider, it's unfiltered. And now I think when they ask for cider, it doesn't even cross my mind that there could be alcohol because I grew up with cider being something that, when you ask for it, it's not until I went back, I filmed quite a bit in the UK and I worked there a lot. I go there and if you ask for, I mean, they have ciders on tap at every single pub imaginable. Often they're quite delicious. They've got some great stuff. But it is a funny thing to think about the birth of apple juice as we know it is this time. It's so recent. It's
Yeah.
100 years ago. I just think that that is such a fascinating thing that I don't think a lot of people learn when they're younger. But of course, these have to be different apples, right? I mean, the apples for cider would be much more tart, would be much more tannic, correct?
Not necessarily.
Do you just let them ripen a little longer and then they get a little higher Brix, higher
Yeah,
sugar?
that is part of it. But also, I mean, that's where the art of cider making comes in. And I spend a lot of time in my book talking about apple varieties for cider. I just did a workshop with people, and they, asking what are the components of a good cider? And it really isn't that different from juice or sweet cider to hard cider in a lot of cases. There's no wrong answer to any of this stuff, but often, the first response is you make what you grow. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of choice. If you had 5 apple trees and 4 of them produced a decent crop in 1 year, well, that's what you're using to make cider.
Fair.
But now, if we had a wider variety of different apples to choose from and to blend, and some people can do that now, it's fun to experiment with using different blends, different press schedules. And, we've written down what we make every year. It changes from year to year, and you can notice the differences. Sometimes the cider will be a little bit snappier, depending on what apples you're using. Sometimes it'll make tremendous hard cider. Sometimes it'll make just regularly good hard cider. North American dessert apples are mostly what surplus apples are mostly what contributes to the vast majority of cider in this country, even today. Macintosh, Cortland, Red Delicious, Gala, Fuji, whatever is left over. And they all contribute to good cider. It's just that they all have generally a similar profile in that they have high sugars and relatively high acid levels. That's what makes them good eating apples, that balance of the two.
Yep.
And that's great. But to make a really, really good hard cider, I feel like you need to have a little bit of backbone to it that the tannins or the phenolic compounds really contribute to. Harrison is a good example of an apple that was rediscovered partly by my friend Tom Burford back in the 1970s, I believe. He found a couple of people who were growing it. That is a perfectly fine, small eating apple. But his main use is for cider because it makes such a thick, syrupy juice. And it also has phenolic compounds in it that are higher than most American apples. It's a distinguished contributor to a hard cider. And that's why it was valued for 200 years like that.
That's a perfect transition into my thoughts on this period between Prohibition. They're pulling orchards down, replanting them, I guess, with whatever was a commercial crop at that point. At what point does the modern craft cider movement happen? So if your friend Tom is looking for old varietals of apples, there must be motivation for that other than just the curiosity of preservation. I mean, he must be looking for these for a purpose. So is this the 70s? Is this period of, say, 40 years or whatever dormancy? Is the 70s when the craft movement starts to pick
I think
back
the
up?
craft movement started as a result of the craft beer movement. And
Interesting.
also, think what you will about Jimmy Carter. I thought he was a pretty good president, but I think the best thing that he did was he signed off on letting people make 200 gallons of their own beer or wine at home. And that was huge back in the 70s. That people could now start screwing around and making it's sort of like, the old days, the old colonial days. You can make your own stuff at home. That was an enormous kick in the pants, obviously, for the craft beer movement. And that took off. But it was originally home brewers who then went commercial. And much the same thing happened years later, back in the 90s, started in the 80s, but it really took off in the 90s with cider. They realized, well, they did all this stuff with craft beer. We could do the same thing with cider.
Well, you mentioned that a lot of the varietals that we can find at the grocery store or the farmer's market or, the corner store, those are what end up being made into cider. But I'm curious, I want to take it back maybe to Johnny Appleseed and his proteges afterwards. Are there any of these old orchards that survived? Were they all cut down? Is it possible to stumble upon an old overgrown orchard in the Appalachians or in Ohio or something like
Oh,
that?
absolutely. Maybe not necessarily a whole orchard, but anywhere where there was an old farmstead that may not even be there anymore. The buildings may have crumbled long ago. An apple tree will live on a standard rootstock, especially barring any accidents, can live for 100 years or more. So that's the thing about preservation and conservation of apple varieties. We continue to find varieties that are functionally extinct, that no nursery catalog carries. that, maybe only one or two people are really looking for. That's happened all over the country now. Just abandoned orchards. Problem is getting a tree that's vital enough where you can get fruit off of it and you can reliably say, well, yeah, definitely this is a such and such apple. It's tough to do that now for 100% certainty unless you have something to compare it to genetically on file. And genetic testing obviously wasn't around 150 years ago. But people are finding apples, old apples that were thought to be gone long ago. I helped propagate an apple variety where there were only 4 known trees left at one orchard called the Granite Beauty. And that was about 15 or 20 years ago that I did that because it was a local apple that I thought was really interesting. And someone just talked to me from Vermont who said they think they've found the old Tinmouth apple variety, which was listed 120 years ago by Beach in Apples of New York, had long thought to be extinct. And a friend of mine found another one.
What does this do to you when you get let's just say somebody calls you and they say, hey, there's these 4 trees. They're off in the woods. They're behind an old wrecked shed. I think we may have found X. I mean, does that make you feel like you're 14 again and you got to go, oh God, let's get out there? I mean, to me, this would be the most exciting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the apples are out there waiting for somebody to rediscover them. Because they have such a long lifespan, if they were on standard-sized trees, they're out there to be found. A friend of mine just identified an apple, another New Hampshire apple, that she had been looking for a few years. And she found one of the apple trees. She found more than one tree, and she thought it might be this caliph variety that was common to her area that she lives in. It was being grown in front of a school, and some, custodian Willie, who was working there was like pruning this.
Groundskeeper
Willie was pruning it with a chainsaw, if you can imagine, and massacring the tree. But there was fruit on it, and she tried the fruit, and she said, "I think this is a caliph apple." She found other examples. She was tromping through people's backyards and saying, "Do you mind if I take some fruit off of your tree because I'm looking for this apple?" Most people get really interested in that whole quest. And she sent the fruit up to John Bunker, my friend up in Maine, who is one of the most famous apple explorers. And Bunk took a look at it and analyzed it. And he said, "I think you're right. I think this is a caliph." So now we've got a few trees growing to see if he's right, see if it's any good.
What is the caliph? Tell me about that. Why does it matter? What's it from?
This farmer who was apparently not very well liked, I don't know, in his local community, named Caliph. He lived around Epping, New Hampshire, which is in Rockingham County on the southeast part of the state. He grew a bunch of apples, I'm sure, and grew other things. What I find interesting about it is it has a historical component to it as well, because one of his friends who came up and helped him graft apple trees, reportedly, was John Hancock, the first governor of Massachusetts, and the large signature on the Declaration of Independence. If we can determine that this is indeed the caliph apple, and all indications so far suggest that it is, that to me is a huge thrill, because I'm interested in the culture as much as the agriculture, the history and the culture.
How do you go about proving it? I mean, is there a preservation of genetic material, or do you have to go on taste? Or
there are pretty close descriptions of what a caliph. I mean, again, if you go back to S.A. Beach and the New York Agricultural Experiment Station, they were growing a lot of these apples, and that was published back in 1902 and 1905. They published this book called The Apples of New York. But there's now, my friend Dan Bussey published a illustrated history of apples in the United States and Canada. It's this massive 7-volume encyclopedia that came out a few years ago. And so there are descriptions of these fruits and also of the trees, how the trees grow, what are the colors of the bark. And people were very good about keeping notes back in the 19th century. So you just make the closest approach you can. It might be something that's slightly different, or it might be pretty darn close to what you're looking for.
are there any unicorns out there, something where you're like, this is the King Tutankhamun. I'm searching for it, and before I die, I want to find it. Is there anything like that?
Well, Tom Burford used to look for, and I've tasted some apples that people used to send him. I mean, he would put out the call for people to send in things, but he was looking for one of Jefferson's favorite apples called the Tolliver, spelled Taliaferro, but it's pronounced Tolliver. He looked for that. He found candidates that were likely but not definitive. Other people feel like they found it. Sometimes you got to be a little bit humble about it too. There's a fellow down in North Carolina who, God love him, he's found a lot of old Southern varieties, but he's also claimed that he's found more old Southern varieties than he probably has. I say that not I know the guy and he's a very nice guy and I celebrate him, but he relies on what people tell him. You know, this is a tree in front of my house and what's this tree? Oh, it's an old Junaleschi. And he goes, Eureka, I found the old Junaleschi. It's here. But you have to grow it out. Just like with the caliph, we're going to have to grow it out and we're going to have to soberly analyze it and decide whether or not we really believe it is the caliph. You can't just sort of take people's opinions about a 120-year-old apple tree and say, oh yeah, that's definitely it.
I hope it's found, and I hope you're the one who does it. This is just too good. The thought of Jefferson's apple, I would watch that movie right now.
You were talking about him not being able to grow vinifera grapes down at Monticello. He couldn't grow he loved the Spitzenberg. He got it from the famous Prince Nursery, the Huguenot nursery on Long Island. And he couldn't grow it for love or money down there. It's a very challenging site, Monticello. I think he was probably putting it in the South Orchard, which is up on the hill there. They don't have any irrigation up there.
Okay.
So it's very challenging to grow things that require a supply of water. In the North Orchard, he had this wonderful cider apple, which is still a wonderful cider apple, called Hughes Crab or Virginia Crab, one of the best American cider apples still. It's been around for over 200 years. You lose your religion picking it because they're only about, maybe this big.
The size of like a clementine or
maybe like a
grape?
Scuppernong grape, possibly, or a little bit smaller. And
wow, tiny apples.
Yeah, they're tiny. But again, like the Harrison, you press it. I've pressed apples from Jefferson's, restored North Orchard, and the stuff comes out and it's just like syrup. It's dark, it's thick, it's viscous, sweet. It's like nothing you've ever had before as cider. It's amazing.
Well, that will be my next cider I'm going to seek out. That's incredible. To close this out, and I can't thank you enough for walking us through all of this, what is the future of cider and apples, and what do you hope people come away with from something like this?
I was thinking about this, and I think that the reason I was so interested in pursuing this 25 plus years ago was because I saw a lot of orchards being turned into housing developments, which just breaks my heart, especially in New England where we don't have that many orchards left anyway. I want to see agricultural land be used for its highest purpose, which is growing crops. And in New England, we have such rocky land that you don't grow a lot of row crops. We're not planting, soybeans horizon to horizon up here. You just couldn't do it.
Right.
So our economy is mostly animals, sheep and cows, and apples. And when I started the project, my goal was and writing about this, was to encourage people to get back into the traditions and the history and the culture of good cider and recognize what it is, to support local orchards, not just in the 3 weeks in the fall when you go out and pick apples, but when I was a kid, you used to be able to go to a local orchard and get apples from August through storage apples in April. And there were only a couple of months out of the year when you couldn't get fresh apples. I'd like to see that restored again. But mainly it's to help the orchardists survive, because I wanted to promote cider as something that is a native, local, value-added product. The economy of growing apples and selling them wholesale, unless you're part of a big cooperative in Washington state, it just doesn't make sense anymore. You can't do that. You haven't been able to do it really since the 1970s or 80s. So I see it as a way to help ultimately agricultural lands and farmers survive.
Me too. Well, this is an amazingly unique and American story, and I have to say, you are doing whatever the Lord's work is in the apple term. So I can't thank you enough for your time, and I hope everybody walks out of this and tries something unique, some small cider from a producer who's worked really hard to grow it. So it means a lot. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Jason.
Today's episode was produced by John Adams. I want to thank Ben Watson for joining us and sharing his insight on cider and the history of that in America. I would also like to thank you for listening. If you love this podcast, please do not forget to rate and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Go to somtv.com to watch our brand new documentary, Verticals, the Lathwaites, and go to blindersgame.com to get the best holiday gift, our blind tasting card game, Blinders. blindersgame.com. Thank you, everyone, so much. Have a nice glass of cider. Let's get ready for the holidays. We'll talk very soon. Bye-bye.